What characteristic here shows discontinuous variation? Figure 17.4 shows continuous variation in height. We can show these data as a histogram. Notice that the scale on the x-axis now goes up steadily rather than having completely separate categories as in figure 17.2. The bars in a histogram touch each other because the scale is continuous. We can also represent continuous variation as a line graph. Very often, we find that the data produce a bell-shaped curve. Most individuals come somewhere in the middle of the range, with smaller numbers at the extremes. Figure 17.4, histogram showing continuous variation in height. Figure 17.5, line graph showing continuous variation in height. The causes of variation. One reason for the differences between individuals is that their genotypes are different. Blood groups, for example, are controlled by genes. There are also genes for hair color, eye color, height, and many other characteristics. Discontinuous variation is almost always caused only by genes. Examples of discontinuous variation include the presence or absence of horns in cattle and wrinkled and round seeds in peas. Figure 17.6, the absence or presence of horns in cattle is an example of discontinuous variation, and it is controlled by a gene. The dominant allele of the gene causes horns to grow. Hornless cattle have 2 copies of the recessive allele of this gene. Figure 17.7, the shape of pea seeds is controlled by 2 alleles. The dominant allele produces round seeds, while the recessive one produces wrinkled seeds. There are no intermediates, the seeds are either wrinkled or round. Another important reason for variation is the difference between the environments of individuals. For example, you may have the genes to enable you to grow tall, but unless you eat a good diet, you will not grow to your full potential height. Features such as body mass and height in humans, which show continuous variation, are affected not only by genes, but also by environment. Only features that are caused by genes are passed on to an organism's offspring. Variation caused by the environment is not passed on. Figure 17.8, some characteristics are caused by genes alone, but others are affected by the environment as well. Causes of genetic variation: mutation. Sometimes, a gene may suddenly change. This is called mutation. Mutation is how new alleles are formed. Mutations are the only source of brand new characteristics that appear in a species. So, mutations are really the source of all genetic variation. Mutations often happen for no apparent reason. They are random events, they can happen at any time, and the change in the gene is unpredictable. However, we do know of many factors that make mutation more likely. One of the most important of these is ionizing radiation, such as X-rays, gamma radiation, beta radiation, and alpha radiation. Radiation can damage the bases in DNA molecules. If this happens in the ovaries or testes, then the altered DNA may be passed on to the offspring. Many different chemicals are known to increase the risk of a mutation happening. Heavy metals such as lead and mercury can interfere with the process in which DNA is copied. If this process goes wrong, the daughter cells will get faulty DNA when the cell divides. Chemicals which can cause mutations are called mutagens. Mutations involve random changes in the base sequence of DNA. The base sequence in DNA determines the amino acid sequence in the proteins that are made in a cell. So, a mutation in DNA results in a change in the proteins that are made. Usually, the change will be harmful if the protein is a different shape, it will not be able to carry out its function. But very occasionally the mutation may be beneficial. We will look at this in topic 17.2. Meiosis. During sexual reproduction, gametes are formed by meiosis. In meiosis, pairs of homologous chromosomes exchange genes and separate from one another, so the gametes which are formed contain different combinations of alleles. Random mating and random fertilization. In most populations of animals and plants, any male individual and any female individual can potentially reproduce together. And any 2 male and female gametes can fuse together at fertilization, so there are many possible combinations of alleles that can be produced in the zygote. In an organism with a large number of genes, the possibility of 2 offspring having identical genotypes is so small that it can be considered almost impossible. Figure 17.9, mutation of a gene controlling coat color has produced a white coat in this tiger. It is unlikely that this tiger could survive in the wild, as it will not be camouflaged and will be unable to catch prey. Experimental Skills 17.1. Measuring continuous variation in humans. In this investigation, you will collect data about continuous variation in the people in your class. You will then practice recording these data in tables and graphs. You will need a ruler or tape measure. Method 1. Measure the length of the third finger of the left hand of everyone in your class. Take the measurement from the knuckle to the fingertip, not including the nail. 2. Divide the finger lengths into suitable categories and record the numbers in each category, like this. Length cm. Number of measurements 8.0, 8.4. 2. 8.5, 8.9. 4. 3. Construct a histogram to display your data. You can use figure 17.4 for guidance. Questions. 1. The category, or class, which has the largest number of individuals in it is called the modal class. What is the modal class for finger length in your results? 2. The mean finger length is the total of all the finger lengths, divided by the number of people in your sample. What is the mean finger length of the sample? 3. Do you think that variation in finger length is affected by genes, the environment, or both? Explain your answer. Questions. 1. State whether each of these features shows continuous variation or discontinuous variation. A. Blood group in humans, B. Foot length in humans, cleaf length in a species of tree, D. Presence of horns in cattle. 2. For each of the examples in A to D above, suggest whether the variation is caused by genes alone or by both genes and environment. 3 inches peas, seeds can be either yellow or green. Plants grown from green seeds are pure breeding, but plants grown from yellow seeds can produce some green seeds when they are bred together. A. Is this an example of continuous variation or discontinuous variation? Explain your answer. B. Explain how this variation is caused. For figure 17.10 shows a maize cob. Each of the kernels in the cob is a new individual. Figure 17.10, a maize cob showing variation in kernel color. Adu's color in maize kernels show continuous variation or discontinuous variation. Explain your answer. B. Estimate the ratio of white, brown kernels in the maize cob. C. Suggest suitable symbols for the alleles that have produced these colors and also suggest the genotypes of the parents that produce the offspring in this maize cob. 5a. State how new alleles of genes are formed. B. List 4 ways in which genetic variation is caused. 17.2 Selection. Every organism has features that help it to survive in its environment. In this topic we will look at how the features of the organism can affect its chances of reproduction and therefore the chances of its genes being passed on to the next generation. Adaptive features. A feature of an organism that is caused by its genes and that helps it to survive and reproduce in its environment is known as an adaptive feature. Some adaptive features are very obvious. All fish, for example, have gills that allow them to obtain oxygen underwater. Different species of fish have adaptations that help them to survive in different environments. For example, fish that live on sand in shallow water may have very flat, sand-colored bodies, so that they are camouflaged from predators. Predatory fish that live in the open ocean have streamlined bodies for fast swimming and teeth that they use to kill their prey. Other adaptive features may not be so easy to spot. For example, the pygmy seahorse and the tuna might have different enzymes in their digestive systems so that they are efficient at digesting the nutrients in their different diets. The tuna might have more mitochondria in its muscle cells than the seahorse to provide more energy through aerobic respiration, allowing it to swim faster. Figure 17.11a, the pygmy seahorse is adapted to be perfectly camouflaged among the sea fans where it lives. B. Tuna are fast-swimming predators with streamlined bodies and strong swimming muscles. Question. 6. Figure 17.12 shows a small mammal called a tarsier. Tarsiers feed on insects, which they hunt in trees at night. What adaptive features can you see in the photograph? Figure 17.12, a tarsier. Xerophytes. Plants that live in deserts can easily run short of water, especially if the temperatures are hot. Desert plants, such as succulents and cacti, must be well adapted to survive in these difficult conditions. Plants that are adapted to live in places where water is in short supply are called xerophytes. All xerophytes have adaptations that help them to survive in a difficult dry environment. Figure 17.13, desert plants have adaptations that help them to conserve water. Closing stomata. Plants lose most water as water vapor through their stomata. If they close their stomata, transpiration slows down to an almost complete stop. Figure 17.14 shows how changes in the guard cells can cause the stoma to open or close. However, if its stomata are closed, the plant cannot photosynthesize because carbon dioxide cannot diffuse into the leaf. Stomata close when it is very hot and dry or when the plant could not photosynthesize anyway, such as at night. Figure 17.14, osmotic changes in the guard cells cause a stoma to open or close. Waxy cuticle. The leaves of desert plants are often covered with a very thick waxy cuticle made by the cells in the epidermis. The wax makes the leaf waterproof. Hairy leaves. Some plants that live in dry places have hairs on their leaves. These hairs trap a layer of moist air next to the leaf. The moist air reduces the diffusion gradient for water vapor from the leaf into the air, so less water vapor diffuses out of the leaf. Figure 17.15, these sempervivum plants have a thick waxy cuticle covering their fleshy leaves to reduce the loss of water vapor. The hairs also help, they trap water vapor in the air among them so that less water vapor diffuses out of the leaves and into the air. Sunken stomata on underside of leaves. In most leaves, there are more stomata on the lower surface than on the upper surface. The lower surface is usually cooler than the upper one, so less water will evaporate. In desert plants, there are often fewer stomata than usual, and the stomata may be sunk into deep pits in the leaf. When water vapor diffuses out through the stomata, it collects in the air trapped in the pits. This reduces the diffusion gradient, so less water diffuses out of the leaf. Figure 17.16, this is a transverse section through a leaf of an oleander plant. On the underside of the leaf, there are two deep pits, and the stomata are inside these. This reduces water loss from the leaf. You can also see hairs on the underside of the leaf. How might these help the plant to survive? Reducing the surface area of the leaves. The smaller the surface area of the leaf, the less water vapor will diffuse out of it. Plants like cacti have leaves that are so small they are just spines. These spines are also useful for preventing hungry and thirsty animals eating the cactus. Instead of using its leaves for photosynthesis, the cactus has chloroplasts in the outer cells in its thick stem. The cells deep inside the stem are adapted to be able to store water. Figure 17.17, this small cactus has spines instead of leaves and a thick stem that can photosynthesize and store water. Having deep or spreading roots. Desert plants may have to seek water very deep down in the soil or across a wide area. They usually have either very deep roots or roots that spread a long way sideways from where the plant is growing. Some have both. In fact, many plants, even those that do not live in deserts, have at least some of these adaptations. For example, a plant growing in your garden may have to cope with hot, dry conditions at least some of the time. Most plants have stomata only on the undersides of their leaves, which close when the need arises. Most of them have waxy cuticles on their leaves to cut down water loss. Desert plants, though, show these adaptations to a much greater extent. Hydrophytes. Plants that live in very wet places, including those that live in water, are called hydrophytes. These plants have no problem of water shortage. They do not need adaptations to conserve water, as desert plants do. The water hyacinth, Icornia crassipes, is an example of a plant adapted to live in fresh water. The roots of water hyacinths do not attach to the bed of the river or pond where they grow but float freely in the water. The stems and leaf stalks have hollow spaces in them, filled with air, which help them to float on the top of the water where they can get plenty of light for photosynthesis. Figure 17.18a, water hyacinth is so well adapted to living in fresh water that it can completely cover lakes and rivers. B. In this photograph, you can see the swollen stems and leaf stalks, filled with air to help them to float. Unlike terrestrial plants, water hyacinths have stomata on the upper surfaces of their leaves as well as on the lower surfaces. This is because the upper surface is in contact with the air, so this is where the carbon dioxide comes from that the plant uses for photosynthesis. There is no need for the stomata to be hidden underneath the leaf, away from the heat of the sun, because the plant does not need to conserve water. There is also no need to close stomata when it is hot. It has more water than it can possibly need. Not all hydrophytes look like water hyacinth. Some, such as kabomba, are adapted to live completely underwater. These plants often have thin leaves that may be really feathery. Feathery leaves spread out easily in the water so that each leaf gets plenty of sunlight. They also help the plant to float and allow strong water currents to flow over the plant without causing damage to its leaves or stems. Other hydrophytes may be attached to the bottom with roots that penetrate into the mud. Unlike xerophytes, there is no need for these roots to grow very deep or to spread very widely, they just need to go deep enough to hold the plant in position. Figure 17.19, the feathery leaves and flexible stems of kabomba are adaptations for living in water. Activity 17.1. Describing adaptive features. Work with a partner for this activity. First, choose an interesting plant or animal. You may be able to study a live one, or you may have to use images on the internet or in books. Now describe the environment in which the organism lives and any features of its lifestyle that you think are important, for example, what it eats, what eats it, how it gets water, and so on. Take a really large sheet of paper and make a large, clear diagram of your chosen organism in the middle of it. Write annotations around the diagram to describe and explain some of the adaptive features that the organism has. For each one, say what the feature is and explain how it helps the organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Self-assessment. Did you find at least 5 adaptive features on your organism? How well do you think you explained how each feature helps the organism to survive and reproduce in its environment? If you were asked to do a similar task in the future, how could you improve what you did? Question 7. Copy and complete this table to compare adaptations of xerophytes and hydrophytes. One row has been done to start you off. Add another row for each feature you think of. Feature: xerophyte, hydrophyte. Roots. Spread widely and/or penetrate deeply into the soil, may hang in the water, sometimes grow into the mud, but not deeply. Selection. In the first topic of this chapter, we saw that individuals within a population are not all the same, they show variation. Within a population of pygmy seahorses, perhaps some have slightly different coloration, so that some are slightly better camouflaged than others. Within a population of tuna, perhaps some individuals have more mitochondria than others, so they can release more energy and swim just a little bit faster than the rest of the population. An animal or plant that is well adapted to its environment is much more likely to survive than one that is not. A pygmy seahorse that was bright blue instead of pink and white would not be camouflaged and would probably be killed and eaten by a predator long before it reached adulthood. Only well-adapted individuals have a good chance of living long enough to reproduce. Adaptive features are caused by genes. Individuals whose alleles give them slightly better adaptive features are more likely to survive and reproduce than the other individuals in the population. So, their alleles are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Over time, this results in more and more of the population having these alleles. The better adapted individuals survive and reproduce, while those that have alleles that do not provide quite as good adaptive features die. We say that the better adapted individuals, those that have alleles that give them slightly better adaptive features, are selected. This process is called natural selection. It is happening all the time in all the populations of all the different species of organism in the world. We can summarize natural selection in 4 points. 1. Variation. There is variation within a population of organisms. Some of these variations are caused by having different alleles of genes. Some of the variation affects the adaptive features of the organisms. 2. Overproduction. Within a wild population, many more offspring are produced than will survive to become adults and reproduce. For example, only about half of all the zebra foals that are born will survive to become adults. 3. Best adapted individuals more likely to survive and reproduce. Within the population, it is the individuals that have the best adaptive features that have the best chance of surviving and reproducing. We can say that there is a struggle for survival. Sometimes, for example, the individuals might have to compete for food if this is in short supply, and only the ones that have the best adaptations for getting food survive. 4 alleles that confer useful adaptations more likely to be passed on. These better adapted individuals are therefore the ones that pass on their alleles to the next generation. The alleles that confer the best chance of survival therefore increase in the population, while alleles that are not advantageous become less common. Figure 17.20. Scientists are not sure why zebras have stripes, but some research suggests it makes them less attractive to blood-sucking flies. This spotty foal, however, has a mutation in the gene producing the pattern on its skin. This could make it less likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Most of the time, natural selection does not make anything change. Zebras have stripes because this is a good adaptation that helps them to survive. A mutation that causes a different pattern is not selected for because it reduces the chance of survival. The allele that causes the spotted pattern in the foal in figure 17.20 will probably not be passed on to the next generation. The population of zebras will stay striped, not become spotty. But sometimes, natural selection can cause change in a population. There are 2 reasons this might happen. A new allele could arise, just by chance, by mutation. If this allele gives an organism a better adaptive feature than any of the other individuals in the population, then this organism will be selected for, that is, it will have a good chance of surviving and reproducing. The new allele will be passed on to the next generation. The environment could change, so that features that once helped an organism to survive are no longer as useful. For example, as climate change progresses, species that now have plenty of plants to eat and water to drink may find that their environment has become drier. Individuals that have adaptive features that help them to survive in this new environment will pass on their alleles, and, over time, there will therefore be change in the adaptive features of the species. Figure 17.21. How natural selection could affect a population of cacti. An example of natural selection. Natural selection can help us to understand some changes that took place in the features of a species of moth in Britain and Ireland. The peppered moth, Biston betularia, lives in most parts of Great Britain and Ireland. It flies by night and spends the daytime resting on tree trunks. It has speckled wings, which camouflage it very effectively on lichen-covered tree trunks. Figure 17.22. 4 peppered moths on a lichen-covered tree trunk. The 2 normal, speckled moths are at the left. The dark ones are a variation caused by a different allele of the gene for wing color. Moth collecting was a fashionable activity in the 19th century, so we know that up until 1849, all the peppered moths in collections were pale and speckled. But in 1849, a dark form of the moth was caught near Manchester. By 1900, 98% of the moths near Manchester were dark. By 1958, there were dark peppered moths in many parts of the country. Figure 17.23. The distribution of the pale form and the dark form of the speckled moth in 1958. How can we explain the sudden rise in numbers of the dark moths and their distribution today? We know that the dark color of the moth is caused by a single dominant allele of a gene. The mutation from a normal to a dark allele happens fairly often, so it is reasonable to assume that there have always been a few dark moths around, as well as pale speckled ones. Up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the pale moths had the advantage, as they were better camouflaged on the lichen-covered tree trunks. The pale moths were more likely to survive and reproduce, so the allele producing the pale color was much more common than the allele for dark wings. But in the middle of the 19th century, some areas of Britain became polluted by smoke. Because the prevailing winds in Britain blow from the west, the worst affected areas were to the east of industrial cities such as Manchester and Birmingham. The polluted air prevented lichens from growing. Dark moths were now better camouflaged than pale moths on trees with no lichens on them. Proof that the dark moths do have an advantage in polluted areas has been supplied by several investigations. Figure 17.24 summarizes one of them. Figure 17.24, an investigation to measure the survival of dark and pale peppered moths in polluted and unpolluted environments. The factor that gives an advantage to the dark moths and a disadvantage to the pale moths in polluted areas is predation by birds. This is called a selection pressure because it selects the dark moths for survival. In unpolluted areas, the pale moths are more likely to survive. Questions. 8. Look at the 4 numbered points summarizing how natural selection happens near the beginning of the section headed Selection. Use these 4 points to summarize how selection caused the proportion of dark-peppered moths near Manchester to increase at the end of the 19th century. 9. Today, in the 21st century, air quality in Britain is much better than it was in the past. It is now very rare to see a dark-peppered moth in Britain. Explain how selection has caused this reversal in the proportions of pale and dark-peppered moths in the population. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. In the previous topics, we have looked at adaptive features of organisms and how these increase their ability to survive and reproduce. The process by which these features develop over many generations in a population, gradually making the population more suited to its environment, is called adaptation. In this section, we will look at how adaptation to a changing environment has resulted in bacterial populations becoming more suited to their environment in ways that are very inconvenient to the human population. When someone is ill, we can often use drugs to help to ease their symptoms or to help them to recover. A drug is a substance that affects metabolic reactions in the body. Drugs that help us to stay healthy are called medicinal drugs. Antibiotics are medicinal drugs that kill bacteria in the body without harming our own cells. They are a very important tool in medicine. Antibiotics help to cure bacterial infections that could otherwise be very serious or even fatal. Antibiotics do not, however, affect viruses, so there is no point in using them to treat viral infections such as colds. Over the last few decades, however, many populations of pathogenic bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics. This has happened by natural selection. These resistant bacteria are no longer killed by the antibiotics. Penicillin is an antibiotic that stops bacteria from forming cell walls. When a person infected with bacteria is treated with penicillin, the bacteria are unable to grow new cell walls and they burst open. However, the population of bacteria in the person's body may contain several million individuals. Within that population, there are likely to be at least 1 or 2 individuals that have an allele that makes them resistant to penicillin. These individuals will have a tremendous selective advantage. They will be able to go on reproducing while all the others cannot. Soon, their descendants, all containing the allele that confers resistance to penicillin, may form a huge population of penicillin-resistant bacteria. Figure 17.25, populations of bacteria become resistant to antibiotics through natural selection. This does, in fact, happen quite frequently. This is one reason why there are so many different antibiotics available. If some bacteria become resistant to one, they can be treated with another. Today, there are many populations of bacteria that have become resistant to more than one antibiotic. The bacterium Staphylococcus aureus lives on the skin of most of us and is normally completely harmless, but it can sometimes cause dangerous infections if it gets through the skin and into the body. In the past, it was easy to treat these infections because S. aureus could be killed with many different antibiotics, including penicillin, amoxicillin, amoxicillin and methicillin. These resistant populations are given the name MRSA, standing for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Doctors do still have a few antibiotics that can kill MRSA, but this bacterium is constantly adapting to its new environmental pressures. It is a kind of race. The bacterium develops, through random mutation and natural selection, a new adaptation that helps it to survive treatment with antibiotics, and we then find new antibiotics to treat it with. The bacterium then becomes resistant to the new antibiotic, and so on. The more we use antibiotics, the more likely it is that resistant populations of bacteria will develop. It is very important to restrict the use of antibiotics as much as we can. Of course, if someone has a serious bacterial infection, they need antibiotics to help them to recover. But it is pointless to give someone antibiotics for a cold or for a minor bacterial infection that the body can fight off on its own. Reducing our use of antibiotics means that bacteria that have resistance to them have no selective advantage, so populations of resistant bacteria are much less likely to arise. Then, when someone really does need to be treated with the antibiotic, it will work. DNA sequences and classification. In topic 17.1, we saw that a mutation produces a change in the base sequence of DNA. If this change is advantageous, natural selection may cause the change to become more common over time as it is passed on to subsequent generations. Over very long periods of time, more and more mutations can occur, so the base sequence of the DNA in a population can become more and more different from their ancestors. Eventually, the DNA may become so different that the population can no longer breed with the one that it originated from. A new species has been produced. Biologists can use this to work out how closely related different species of organisms are. DNA-based sequences are now quite often used to help to classify organisms into species, genera, families, and so on. DNA is extracted from the cells of an organism of one species, and the base sequence of certain parts is determined. The same procedure is carried out for another organism, and the two sets of base sequences are compared. If they are identical, then the two organisms probably belong to the same species. If they are different, this suggests that the organisms may belong to different species. If there are a lot of differences in the DNA base sequences of the two species, this suggests that there has been time for many mutations to happen since the two species stopped breeding with one another. They are only distantly related to one another and share only a distant ancestor. If there are only a few differences in the DNA base sequences, this could mean that the two species only stopped breeding with each other a relatively short while ago. They are quite closely related to one another and share a recent ancestor. Figure 17.26a, a wild mouflon. This is the wild species of sheep from which we think all the domesticated breeds have been developed. B. Selective breeding for thick, high-quality wool production has produced the merino breed of sheep. C. Selective breeding for the ability to survive in harsh environments has produced the Damora breed of sheep. Selective breeding. Humans can bring about changes in living organisms by selecting certain individuals for breeding. Figure 17.26 shows examples of the results of this kind of selection. For example, from the varied individuals among a herd of cattle, the breeder chooses the ones with the characteristics he or she wants to appear in the next generation. He or she then allows these individuals, and not the others, to breed. If this selection process is repeated over many generations, these characteristics will become the most common ones in the population. The process of choosing only certain animals or plants to breed is called artificial selection or selective breeding. It has been going on for thousands of years, ever since humans first began to cultivate plants and to domesticate animals. It works in just the same way as natural selection. Individuals with advantageous characteristics breed, while those with disadvantageous ones do not. Even when a particular breed has been produced, farmers will still continue to use selective breeding to enhance the characteristics that they choose. Imagine, for example, that a farmer has a herd of cows which she keeps for milk production. She wants to improve her herd. She will follow these steps. 1. Choose only the cows that produce large volumes of high-quality milk. 2. Choose a bull whose mother, sisters and/or daughters produce large volumes of high-quality milk. 3. Breed the chosen cows with the chosen bull. 4. Allow the calves to grow to adults. From this generation, select the cows that produce the greatest volumes of high-quality milk, and breed them with the chosen bull. 5. Repeat for many generations. Sometimes, the breeder may want to combine two useful characteristics. So, she might, for example, choose to breed a cow that produces high-quality milk with a bull that is very docile. If she repeats this over several generations, she should be able to produce cows that are both easy to handle and good milk producers. Questions. 10. Sheep produce methane, which is a greenhouse gas. In New Zealand, farmers are using selective breeding to produce flocks of sheep that produce less methane. Outline how they can do this. 11. Wheat is a cereal crop that is attacked by many different pests, including a fungus called yellow rust. Some varieties of wheat have quite good resistance to yellow rust, but do not produce high yields. A. Describe how you could use selective breeding to produce a new variety of wheat that has good resistance to yellow rust and produces high yields. B. When resistant varieties of wheat are produced by selective breeding, it is often found that, after a few years, they are infected by yellow rust again. Explain how natural selection might cause the yellow rust to become able to infect the resistant varieties of wheat. Comparing natural selection and selective breeding. There are many similarities between natural selection and selective breeding. In both, only certain individuals survive and breed. However, there are also many differences between them, both in how they work and their results. In natural selection, it is the environment that determines or selects which individuals are able to survive and breed. In artificial selection, it is humans that do this. In natural selection, there is random mating between individuals. Animals choose their own mates, while plants can receive pollen from any anthers onto any stigmas. In artificial selection, humans determine which individuals reproduce with each other. In natural selection, adaptive features that increase the chances of an individual surviving and reproducing are selected for. These adaptive features help the organism to survive in its natural environment. But in selective breeding, the features that are selected for are not adaptive features. They are the features that the breeder wants. These features might actually make it less likely that the organism could survive in the wild. Figure 17.27, this merino sheep got lost, so his wool was not removed by a farmer for many years. Merino sheep have been selectively bred to produce a lot of wool, and his wool weighed so much that he almost died. He was eventually found and his wool removed. In natural selection, the selective advantage of a particular feature can be quite small. The race only a slightly better chance of some individuals surviving rather than others, and even individuals that don't have the best adaptive features still have a chance of reproducing. In artificial selection, only the very best organisms are chosen to reproduce. The relatively weak selection pressures in natural selection mean that the amount of variation that is present in a wild population is often much greater than in a population produced by artificial selection. With natural selection, the speed of change in a population is usually quite slow. In many cases, there is no change at all over time. With artificial selection, quite large changes in features can happen over quite short periods of time. Summary. Differences between individuals of the same species are called variation. Continuous variation occurs when an individual can have any phenotype in a complete range between the two extremes. There are no distinct categories. It is caused by genes and the environment. Human height and body mass are examples of continuous variation. Discontinuous variation occurs when there is a limited number of phenotypes, such as the A, B, AB and O blood groups in humans. It is caused by genes alone. Other examples include wrinkled and smooth peas and green and yellow peas. Mutation is genetic change. It is the way that new alleles are formed. The chance of mutation happening is increased by ionizing radiation and some chemicals. Gene mutation is a random change in the base sequence of DNA. Mutation, meiosis, random mating and random fertilization are sources of genetic variation in populations. An adaptive feature is an inherited feature that increases the chance that an individual will survive and reproduce. Xerophytes are plants that have adaptive features that enable them to survive and reproduce where water is in short supply. Hydrophytes have adaptive features that help them to survive and reproduce in water. Natural selection acts on variation among the individuals in a population. More offspring are produced than will survive to adulthood, and those individuals with the best adaptations to their environment are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We can say that there is a struggle for survival, including competition for resources such as food supply. The best adapted individuals are therefore more likely to pass on their alleles to the next generation. Adaptation is the process resulting from natural selection by which populations become better adapted to survive and reproduce in their environment over many generations. The development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria is an example of natural selection. Differences in the DNA sequences of organisms caused by mutation and natural selection over time can be used to determine how closely related they are and to classify them. Selective breeding involves humans selecting individual animals or plants with desirable features to breed together, repeating this process with the offspring, and then repeating again for several generations. It is used to improve crop plants and domestic animals. Natural selection is slower than artificial selection and maintains more variation in the population than artificial selection does. The features selected for in natural selection are those that adapt organisms for their environment, whereas in artificial selection the features are those chosen by humans, which may not be adaptive features. Project. Using beads to investigate the effects of selection. Figure 17.28, Different types of brassica. How do so many different types of vegetables arise from one type of plant? Specific selection pressures can lead to changes in phenotypes and produce a wide range of new breeds. In the case of these brassicas, artificial selection for specific characteristics has produced 6 different vegetables. In this project, you are going to use beads to model natural or artificial selection. In Chapter 16, you may have used different colors of beans or beads to represent alleles in the activity breeding beads. In this project, we are going to do something similar, but with some important changes to the procedure. You will use the beads as in that activity to model how alleles are passed on from one generation to the next and to predict the ratios of the different genotypes and phenotypes in the next generation. However, this time, you are going to apply a selection pressure against a specific genotype to each generation of beads. Here is how to do this. Put 100 red beads and 100 yellow beads into a large beaker. This is your population of organisms. The beads represent the alleles and the gametes that they make. Red beads represent allele A and yellow beads represent allele A. Without looking, pick out 2 beads from the container. These represent the result of 2 individuals in the population mating. Record the genotype of the offspring you have just produced. Put these beads into another container. Keep doing this until you have used up all the beads in your initial population. Write down the number of organisms of each genotype that you have produced in the next generation. Now let your new generation breed, just as the first one did. But this time, apply selection pressure to the AA offspring. Let's say that 1 in 5 of them do not survive to reproduce. To model this, remove every 5th offspring with the genotype AA from your populations. Record your results again. Keep going, repeating your 1 in 5 selection against the AA offspring for several generations. Other groups could try different selection pressures like this. Selection pressure against homozygous recessive individuals. What you do? 5%. Remove every 20th offspring from the population 10%. Remove every 10th offspring from the population 20%. Remove every 5th offspring from the population 25%. Remove every 4th offspring from the population 50%. Remove every 2 NDA offspring from the population 100%. Remove every R offspring from the population. When all the groups have collected results, discuss what you have found. Here are 2 issues you may like to discuss. 1. How do your selection pressures affect the proportion of homozygous recessive organisms in the population? Do they ever disappear completely? 2. How well do you think this model represents what really happens in a population of organisms? Reflection. This is quite a time-consuming process for you, and it is easy to get the beads muddled up. What did you do to help to keep focused and to avoid mistakes? Are there other activities that you regularly do in your biology work where you have to work hard to stay focused? What tactics do you use to help you? Exam-style questions. 1. Which is an example of continuous variation? AABO blood groups in humans, body mass in humans, seed color in peas. DR seed shape in peas. 2. How are new alleles formed? AB artificial selection, BBY continuous variation, CBY discontinuous variation. DBY mutation. 3. What 2 words are missing from this description of an adaptive feature? And 1 feature that helps an organism to survive and 2 in its environment. 1. 2. 4. Which process almost always results in adaptation to the environment? Artificial selection, mutation, natural selection. Selective breeding. 6. Copy and complete the following sentences using words from the list. You may use each word once, more than once, or not at all. Adapted, continuous, discontinuous, environment, genes, genus, matched, mutation, selection, sex, species. Variation can be defined as differences between individuals belonging to the same Sometimes, the differences are clear-cut, and each individual fits into one of a small number of defined categories. This is called variation. This kind of variation is caused by the organisms. In other cases, the differences have no definite categories. This is called variation. New features can arise when new alleles are produced by. This is usually harmful because these changes make an organism less well to its environment. 7A farmer used selective breeding to try to improve the milk yield in her herd of cows. The graph below shows the mean yield of milk per cow over the 11 years that the farmer carried out selective breeding. 5. What is the difference between natural selection and artificial selection? A. Artificial selection produces more variation in a population than natural selection. B. Natural selection happens more slowly than artificial selection. C. Selection pressures in natural selection are generally stronger than in artificial selection. D. The chance of mutation taking place in natural selection is greater than in artificial selection. A. Describe the changes in mean milk yield during the selective breeding program. B. Describe how the breeder would have carried out the breeding program. C. Explain why the breeder does not need to know anything about the genes that affect milk production in order to carry out a successful breeding program. D. The mean percentage protein content of the milk in year 1 was 3.83. This steadily fell, reaching 3.79 in year 11. Suggest why this happened. 8. The graph below shows the number of deaths caused by MRSA and by non-resistant Staphylococcus aureus in a European country between 1993 and 2012. A. Describe the changes in the number of deaths from MRSA between 1993 and 2012. B. The percentage of deaths from S. aureus that were caused by MRSA in 1993 was 8.3%. Calculate the percentage of deaths from S. aureus that were caused by MRSA in 2006. In 2006, new procedures were introduced into hospitals to try to prevent the increase in cases of MRSA. Suggest and explain 2 changes that could have helped to cause the subsequent change in the number of cases of MRSA shown on the graph. A. Explain what is meant by gene mutation. B. State 2 factors that can increase the rate of gene mutation. C. Explain how gene mutation results in changes in phenotype in an individual. D. Outline the sources of genetic variation, other than mutation, in a population. 9. Gene mutation is a source of genetic variation in a population. Self-evaluation checklist. After studying this chapter, think about how confident you are with the different topics. This will help you to see any gaps in your knowledge and help you to learn more effectively. I can see topic. Needs more work. Almost there. Confident to move on. Describe variation as differences between individuals belonging to the same species. 17.1. Explain the differences between continuous variation and discontinuous variation and give examples. 17.1. Investigate, record and analyze examples of continuous and discontinuous variation. 17.1. State that mutation is the way that new alleles are formed. 17.1. State factors that increase the rate of mutation. 17.1. Describe what an adaptive feature is and interpret images to describe an organism's adaptive features. 17.2. Describe natural selection resulting from variation, overproduction of offspring, struggle for survival, reproduction by organisms with better adaptations and the passing on of their alleles to the next generation. 17.2. Describe gene mutation as a random change in the base sequence of DNA. 17.1. List the 4 sources of genetic variation in populations. 17.1. Explain how xerophytes and hydrophytes are adapted to their environments. 17.2. Describe how selective breeding is done and how it can be used to improve crop plants and domesticated animals. 17.2. Explain how populations of bacteria resistant to antibiotics have arisen by natural selection. 17.2. Explain how DNA sequences can be used to estimate how closely related two groups of organisms are. 17.2. Compare natural and artificial selection. 17.2. Chapter 18. Organisms and their environment. In this chapter you will explain how energy is transferred through food webs and back to the environment. Practice using pyramids of number and biomass. Describe nutrient cycles in ecosystems. Use graphs and diagrams to describe and explain population growth. Explain why pyramids of energy or biomass provide more useful information than pyramids of number. Getting started. Ask one person in your class to write the name of a plant or animal on the board. Now, another person writes the name of a plant or animal that eats, or is eaten by, the first one, and adds an arrow to show how energy transfers from one to the other. Continue like this until your class has constructed a really big food web on the board. A fossil food chain. About 250 million years ago, there was a huge supercontinent on Earth, called Pangaea. The center of this enormous landmass was so far from the sea that rain rarely fell. Later, as the plates that make up the Earth's crust drifted apart, Pangaea broke up. Some of the northern areas became what is now Russia. We know something about the animals that lived in this area at that time because we have found their fossils. We know that there were herbivores that ate vegetation and carnivores that fed on the herbivores. We can work this out from their skeletons and teeth. For example, if an animal has broad, flat teeth with ridges on them, this suggests it was adapted to feed on plants. If its teeth were pointed and sharp, this suggests it killed and ate other animals. It's difficult, though, to be certain exactly what any one species ate, and we have only limited evidence about the food chains and food webs that might have existed 250 million years ago in this part of the world. One strong possibility is that a carnivore called Inostrancevia preyed on an herbivore called Scutosaurus. Fossils of both of these dinosaurs are found in similar areas and date from the same time. Inostrancevia was probably the apex predator at the time. It was up to 3.5 m long and had a huge skull with upper canines that grew to 15 centimeters long. Discussion questions. 1. How do you think scientists can work out food chains and food webs today? What evidence can they use and how might they collect this evidence? 2. How does this differ from the kind of evidence that scientists can use to try to construct food chains and food webs in the distant past? Figure 18.1, Inostrancevia and Scutosaurus. 18.1 Energy flow and food webs. One very important way of studying living things is to study them where they live. Animals and plants do not live in complete isolation. They are affected by their environment. Their environment is also affected by them. The study of the interaction between living organisms and their environment is called ecology. There are many words that you need to be able to use when you learn, talk and write about ecology. Here are some, and you will meet quite a few more as you work through this chapter. The area where an organism lives is called its habitat. Each species of organism has adaptive features that enable it to live in its specific habitat. The habitat of a tadpole might be a pond. There will probably be many tadpoles in the pond, forming a population of tadpoles. A population is a group of organisms of the same species, living in the same area at the same time. Tadpoles will not be the only organisms living in the pond. There will be many other kinds of animals and plants making up the pond community. A community is all the organisms of all the different species living in the same habitat. The interactions between the living organisms in the pond, the water in it, the stones and the mud at the bottom, make up an ecosystem. An ecosystem consists of the interactions between the organisms in a community and their environment. Figure 18.2, a pond and its inhabitants, an example of an ecosystem. Within the ecosystem, each living organism has its own life to live and role to play. The way in which an organism lives its life in an ecosystem is called its niche. Tadpoles, for example, eat algae and other weeds in the pond, they disturb pebbles and mud at the bottom of shallow areas in the pond, they excrete ammonia into the water, they breathe in oxygen from the water, and breathe out carbon dioxide. All these things and many others help to describe the tadpole's role or niche in the ecosystem. Energy flow. All living organisms need energy. All the energy in an ecosystem originates from the sun. Some of the energy in sunlight is captured by plants and used to make organic nutrients, glucose, starch and other organic substances such as fats and proteins. These contain some of the energy from the sunlight. When a plant cell needs energy, it breaks down some of this food by respiration. Animals get their food, and therefore their energy, by ingesting plants, or by eating animals which have eaten plants. Again, when a cell needs energy to carry out a particular process, such as muscle contraction or active transport, the energy is released by respiration. The sequence by which energy, in the form of chemical energy in food, passes from a plant to an animal and then to other animals, is called a food chain. Figure 18.3 shows one example of a food chain. Figure 18.3, a food chain. Many different food chains link to form a food web. Figure 18.4 shows an example of a food web. Figure 18.4, a food web. Producers and consumers. Every food chain begins with green plants because only they can capture the energy from sunlight. They are called producers because they produce the energy-containing organic nutrients that all the other organisms in the food chain need. Animals are consumers. An animal that gets its energy by eating plants is a primary consumer because it is the first consumer in a food chain. An animal which eats that animal is a secondary consumer. An animal that eats a secondary consumer is a tertiary consumer. Rarely, there may also be animals that get their energy by eating tertiary consumers and they are called quaternary consumers. Primary consumers are also called herbivores and consumers that eat other animals are called carnivores. Fungi are also consumers. They get their energy by feeding on dead and decaying bodies and waste organic material from plants and animals. Consumers that feed like this are called decomposers. Activity 18.1. Matching ecology terms. Work in a small group for this activity. You need 26 identical pieces of card. On one side of 13 of them, write one of the keywords you have met in this chapter. On one side of the other 13, write the meanings of these keywords. Shuffle the cards. Place them all upside down on the table and spread them out. The first person turns over a card and reads what it says. Everyone in the group must be able to see that card. The same person then turns over another card and reads what that card says. If the two cards give a word and its meaning, the person keeps the cards and has another go. If the two cards do not match, then the cards are turned face down again in their original positions. The next person then takes their turn. The winner is the person with the most cards when all 22 cards have been matched. Energy losses. As energy is passed along a food chain, some of it is lost to the environment. This happens in several ways. When an organism uses glucose and other organic compounds for respiration, some of the energy released from the glucose is lost as heat energy to the environment. When one organism eats another, it rarely eats absolutely all of it. For example, the grasshopper in the food chain in Figure 18.3 may eat almost all of the parts of the plant above ground, but it will not eat the roots. So not all of the energy in the plant is transferred to the grasshopper. When an animal eats another organism, enzymes in its digestive system break down most of the large nutrient molecules so that they can be absorbed. But not all of the nutrient molecules are digested and absorbed. Some just pass through the alimentary canal and are eventually lost from the body in the feces. These feces contain energy that is lost from this food chain. This means, the further you go along a food chain, the less energy is available for each successive group of organisms. In Figure 18.5, the plants get a lot of energy from the sun, but only a fraction of this energy is absorbed by the grasshoppers, and only a fraction of that is absorbed by the flycatcher birds. We can therefore think of energy as flowing from the sun as energy and light, then through a food chain in the form of chemical energy in organic nutrients, and finally back to the environment as heat energy. Figure 18.5, energy is lost to the environment as it passes along a food chain. Questions. 1 inch a desert, kangaroo rats eat seeds of creosote bushes. Some of the kangaroo rats are eaten by kit foxes. Coyotes eat kit foxes. Figure 18.6a, a kangaroo rat. B. Kit foxes. A. Show this information as a food chain. B. Name the producer in this food chain. C. Identify the primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer in this food chain. D. Which organisms in the food chain are herbivores? Which are carnivores? E. Leaves of creosote bushes are also eaten by grasshoppers and jackrabbits. Kit foxes also eat jackrabbits. Grasshoppers are eaten by kit foxes and tarantulas. Add this information to your food chain to make a food web. 2. Construct a food chain of your own with a human at the end of it. Label your food chain to show the producer and also the different levels of consumers. 3. Most food chains have only a few links, and it is very rare to find a food chain that has more than 5 links in it. Suggest an explanation for this. Trophic levels. If we count the numbers of organisms at different positions in a food chain, we usually find that there are more plants than animals and more herbivores than carnivores. We can show this by drawing a kind of graph called a pyramid of numbers. In the pyramid, the area of each block represents the number of organisms at that step in the food chain. Each level in the pyramid is called a trophic level. Figure 18.7, a pyramid of numbers. The pyramid is this shape because there is less energy available as you go up the trophic levels, so there are fewer organisms at each level. There is a lot of energy for the plants in this ecosystem. The grasshoppers that eat the plants do not get all of this energy because most is lost to the environment. This means that there cannot be as many grasshoppers as there are plants, there is simply not enough energy to support them. In the same way, the flycatchers only receive a small proportion of the energy that the grasshoppers contain. Only enough energy reaches the flycatchers to support a small population of them. Many organisms feed at more than one trophic level. You, for example, are a primary consumer when you eat vegetables, a secondary consumer when you eat meat or drink milk, and a tertiary consumer when you eat a predatory fish such as a salmon. Pyramids of biomass. Figure 18.8 shows a differently shaped pyramid of numbers. The pyramid is this shape because of the masses of the organisms in the food chain. Although there is only a single tree, it is huge compared with the caterpillars which feed on it. Figure 18.8, an inverted pyramid of numbers. If you make the areas of the blocks represent the mass of the organisms instead of their numbers, then the pyramid becomes the right shape again. It is called a pyramid of biomass. Pyramids of biomass are much better than pyramids of number because they take the size of each organism into account. They give us a much better idea of the quantity of energy at each level than a pyramid of numbers does. Figure 18.9, a pyramid of biomass. Activity 18.2. Working with pyramids. Task 1. Look at the food chain that you drew for question 1a. A scientist counted the number of creosote bushes, kangaroo rats, kit foxes and coyotes in an area of the desert. He found that for every 122 creosote bushes, there were 21 kangaroo rats, 5 kit foxes and 1 coyote. Figure 18.10 shows the first part of a pyramid of numbers to show this information. Figure 18.10, the start of a scale diagram of a pyramid of numbers. Copy and complete this diagram using graph paper. Add labels to show the names of the organisms and the trophic levels. Task 2. The mean masses of the organisms in this food chain are creosote bush 24 kg, kangaroo rat 0.9 kg, kit fox 2.5 kg, coyote 15 kg. Use this information and the pyramid of numbers that you have just drawn to construct a pyramid of biomass. Peer assessment. Exchange your pyramid of biomass with a partner. Assess how successful they have been in drawing the pyramid. Are the bars drawn carefully with a ruler? Are the bars stacked symmetrically on one another? Is each bar the correct length? Are the bars clearly and fully labeled? Question. For a food chain shows only one particular route through a food web. For example, kangaroo rats eat the seeds of many different kinds of plants, not only creosote. Bushes. Explain how this could affect the shape of a pyramid of numbers or pyramid of biomass that is drawn for a single food chain. Pyramids of energy. Pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass are useful ways of visualizing the numbers or masses of organisms at different levels of a food chain or food web. But, as we have seen, what actually determines the numbers or biomass of organisms at each trophic level is the quantity of energy that is available to them. We can draw a pyramid of energy to show this. Figure 18.11 is a sketch of a pyramid of energy for a food web in a grassland ecosystem. Figure 18.11, a pyramid of energy for a food web in a grassland ecosystem. Notice that the units for the quantity of energy at each level are given in kJ per square meter per year. This measurement shows how much energy passes through each trophic level in 1 square meter of the grassland in 1 year. It is a good way of measuring the energy flow through the ecosystem. How could these data be collected? It is really difficult and time-consuming to do. The researchers would first have to work out all the links in the food web. Then they would have to collect or capture samples of each organism. Then they would have to find out how much energy each organism, or each gram of an organism, contains. This is done by killing the organism, drying it, and then burning it to measure how much energy is released. The researchers would need to count the numbers of each organism or measure their biomass. Then they can use the results for the energy content of each organism to work out the total quantity of energy at each trophic level. Not surprisingly, this is not done very often. It is much easier to collect the data to draw a pyramid of numbers or even a pyramid of biomass. So, although pyramids of energy are the best way of showing energy flow through an ecosystem, they are very difficult to produce. Pyramids of biomass are the next best type to use. They are not as informative as pyramids of energy because we cannot be sure that 1 gram of biomass for one species contains the same quantity of energy as 1 gram of biomass of a different species. Efficiency of energy transfer. Understanding how energy is passed along a food chain can be useful in agriculture. Humans can eat a wide variety of foods and can feed at several different trophic levels. Which is the most efficient sort of food for a farmer to grow and for us to eat? The nearer to the beginning of the food chain we feed, the more energy there is available for us. This is why our staple foods such as wheat, rice and potatoes are plants. When we eat meat, eggs or cheese or drink milk, we are feeding further along the food chain. There is less energy available for us from the original energy provided by the sun. It would be more efficient, in principle, for humans to eat the grass in a field rather than to let cattle eat it and then to eat them. But although there is far more energy in the grass than in the cattle, it is not available to us. We simply cannot digest the cellulose in grass, so we cannot release the energy from it. The cattle can, they turn the energy in cellulose into energy in protein and fat, which we can digest. However, there are many plant products which we can eat. Soya beans, for example, yield a large amount of protein much more efficiently and cheaply than cattle or other animals. It is not energy efficient to feed soya beans to cattle and then eat the cattle. Questions. 5. Look at figures 18.8 and 18.9. Sketch a pyramid of energy for this food chain. 6. Figure 18.12 shows a dairy farm. This is in a desert region where there is no grass for cattle to graze. Instead, the cattle are fed on soya beans. Explain why this is not an energy-efficient way of producing food for humans. Figure 18.12, a dairy farm. 18.2 Nutrient cycles. Decomposers. One very important group of organisms which is easy to overlook when you are studying an ecosystem is the decomposers. As we have seen, decomposers feed on organic waste material from animals and plants and on their dead bodies. Many fungi and bacteria are decomposers. Decomposers are extremely important because they help to release substances from dead organisms. The released substances can then be used by other living organisms. 2 of these substances are carbon and nitrogen. The carbon cycle. Carbon is a very important component of living things because carbon atoms are part of the molecules of carbohydrates, fats and proteins. Figure 18.13 shows how carbon circulates through an ecosystem. Figure 18.13, the carbon cycle. About 0.04% of the air is carbon dioxide. When plants photosynthesize, carbon atoms from carbon dioxide become part of glucose and starch molecules in the plant. Some of the glucose is then broken down by the plant in respiration. The carbon in the glucose becomes part of a carbon dioxide molecule again and is released back into the air. Some of the carbon-containing compounds in the plant will be eaten by animals. The animals respire, releasing some of it back into the air as carbon dioxide. When the plant or animal dies, decomposers will feed on them. Decomposers also feed on waste materials, such as urine and feces from animals. The carbon becomes part of the carbon-containing compounds in the decomposers' bodies. When the decomposers respire, they release carbon dioxide into the air again. Sometimes, however, dead bodies and waste materials are not broken down by decomposers. For example, in places where there is little oxygen such as the seabed in the deep oceans or in waterlogged ground, decomposers may not be able to respire aerobically. Instead, these waste substances become buried in sediments. Over long periods of time, they are gradually changed into coal, oil, or natural gas. These are called fossil fuels not because they contain fossils, but because they were formed millions of years ago from living organisms. When these fossil fuels are burnt, the carbon in them combines with oxygen from the air in a process called combustion. Wood can also undergo combustion. The carbon and oxygen combine to form carbon dioxide, which is released into the air again. Figure 18.14, this coal is undergoing combustion. Activity 18.3. Modeling the carbon cycle. In this activity, you will use people to represent carbon atoms and explore how a carbon atom can move around the carbon cycle. It's best to do this activity as a whole class. Start by looking at Figure 18.13. Choose 5 areas in the room to represent the 5 places that a carbon atom can be, shown in blue on the diagram. Label these areas in the room. Now choose some people to be carbon atoms. Put some carbon atoms in each labeled area. Someone who is not a carbon atom now calls out one of the processes on a labeled arrow. Some of the carbon atoms affected by this process move to a different place. For example, if the process is a combustion, some of the carbon atoms in the fossil fuel area move to the air area. Carry on with this, using different processes at random. Reflection. Did using this model help you to understand the carbon cycle? Can you explain why it helped or why it did not? How well do you think the model represents the carbon cycle? Can you think of any ways in which you could refine the model to make it easier to understand? Questions. 7. Look at Figure 18.13. A. List the processes that remove carbon dioxide from the air. B. List the processes that add carbon dioxide to the air. 8. Describe how a carbon atom in a lion could become part of a grass plant. The nitrogen cycle. Living things need nitrogen to make proteins and also to make DNA. There is plenty of nitrogen around. The air is about 78% nitrogen gas. Molecules of nitrogen gas, N, are made of 2 nitrogen atoms joined together. These molecules are very inert, which means that they will not readily react with other substances. So, although the air is full of nitrogen, it is in such an unreactive form that plants and animals cannot use it at all. It must first be changed into a more reactive form, such as ammonia or nitrates. Changing nitrogen gas into a more reactive form is called nitrogen fixation. There are several ways that nitrogen fixation can happen. Figure 18.15, the nitrogen cycle. Lightning. Lightning makes some of the nitrogen gas in the air combine with oxygen, forming nitrogen oxides. They dissolve in rain and are washed into the soil, where they form nitrates. Artificial fertilizers. Nitrogen and hydrogen can be made to react in an industrial chemical process, forming ammonia. The ammonia is used to make ammonium compounds and nitrates, which are sold as fertilizers. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in the soil or in root nodules on plants such as peas, beans and clover. They use nitrogen gas from the air spaces in the soil and combine it with other substances to make ammonium ions and other compounds. Once the nitrogen has been fixed, plants can use it to make amino acids, which can then be used to make proteins. Animals eat the plants, so animals get their nitrogen in the form of proteins. When an animal or plant dies, bacteria and fungi decompose the body. The protein, containing nitrogen, is broken down to ammonium ions and this is released. Another group of bacteria, called nitrifying bacteria, turn these ions into nitrates, which plants can use again. Changing ammonium ions to nitrates is called nitrification. Nitrogen is also returned to the soil when animals excrete nitrogenous waste material which they have produced by deamination of excess amino acids. The nitrogen may be in the form of ammonia or urea. Again, nitrifying bacteria will convert it to nitrates. A third group of bacteria complete the nitrogen cycle. They are called denitrifying bacteria because they undo the work done by nitrifying bacteria. They turn nitrates and ammonia in the soil into nitrogen gas, which goes into the atmosphere. This process is called denitrification. Questions. 9. Outline the importance of each of these processes in the nitrogen cycle and nitrogen fixation nitrification. 10 microorganisms bring about 4 of the steps in the nitrogen cycle shown in Figure 18.15. What are these 4 steps and how are microorganisms involved in each of them? 11. Deamination is not shown on Figure 18.15. Where does deamination happen and what change takes place? 12a. Soil is said to be waterlogged when there is so much water in it that there is not much room for air. In these circumstances, denitrifying bacteria work much faster than nitrogen-fixing ones. Carnivorous plants, such as sundews, often live in these places. These are plants that capture and digest insects by producing proteases that they secrete onto the insect's body. Suggest why carnivorous plants are usually found growing in waterlogged soils. Figure 18.16, a sundew leaf with a partly digested fly. 18.3 Populations. We have seen that a population is all the individuals of a particular species that live together in the same area at the same time. In this topic, we will look at how and why population sizes change. Most populations tend to stay roughly the same size over a period of time. They may go up and down, but the average population will probably stay the same over a number of years. The population of greenfly in a garden, for example, might be much greater one year than the next. But their numbers will almost certainly be back to normal in a year or so. Over many years, the sizes of most populations tend to remain at around the same level. Yet if all the offspring of one female greenfly survived and reproduced, she could be the ancestor of 600 billion greenfly in just 1 year. Why doesn't the greenfly population shoot upwards like this? Why isn't the world overrun with greenfly? Figure 18.17, greenfly feed on plant juices. Each adult greenfly can produce huge numbers of young in a very short time. The answers to those questions are of great importance to human beings because our own population is doing just that. It is shooting upwards at an alarming rate. Every hour, there are more than 9,000 extra people in the world. We need to understand why this is happening and what is likely to happen next. Can we slow down the increase? What happens if we don't? Birth rate and death rate. The size of a population depends on how many individuals leave the population and how many enter it. Individuals leave a population when they die or when they migrate to another population. Individuals enter a population when they are born or when they migrate into the population from elsewhere. Usually, births and deaths are more important in determining population sizes than immigration and emigration. A population increases if new individuals are born faster than the old ones die, that is, when the birth rate is greater than the death rate. If birth rate is less than death rate, the population will decrease. If birth rate and death rate are equal, the population will stay the same size. This explains why we are not knee-deep in greenfly. Although the greenfly population's birth rate is enormous, the death rate is also enormous. Greenfly are eaten by ladybirds and birds and sprayed with pesticides by gardeners and farmers. Over a period of time, the greenfly's birth and death rates stay about the same, so the population doesn't change very much. Factors affecting population growth. By looking at changes in population sizes in other organisms, we can learn quite a lot about our own. Many experiments on population sizes have been done on organisms like bacteria and yeast because they reproduce quickly and are easy to grow. Figure 18.18 shows the results of an experiment in which a few yeast cells are put into a container of nutrient broth. The cells feed on the broth, grow and reproduce. The numbers of yeast cells are counted every few hours. Figure 18.18, the growth of a population of yeast. For the first 12 hours, the population grows only quite slowly because there are not many cells there to reproduce. They also need time to adjust to the new conditions. This is called the lag phase. But once they get going, growth is very rapid. Each cell divides to form 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. There is nothing to hold them back except the time it takes to grow and divide. This is called the log phase or the exponential phase. As the population gets larger, the individual cells can no longer reproduce as fast and begin to die off more rapidly. This may be because there is not enough food left for them all, so that there is competition for food. It could also be because they have made so much ethanol that they are poisoning themselves. The cells are now dying off as fast as new ones are being produced, so the population stops growing and levels off. This is called the stationary phase. Eventually, the death rate exceeds the birth rate, so the number of living yeast cells in the population starts to fall. This is called the death phase. This curve is sometimes called a sigmoid growth curve. Sigma is the old Greek letter S, so sigmoid means S-shaped. Limiting factors and population growth. Although the experiment with the yeast is done in artificial conditions, a similar pattern is found in the growth of populations of many species in the wild. If a few individuals move into a new environment, then their population curve may be very like the one for yeast cells in the flask. The population takes a while to settle in, then increases quickly, and then levels off. We have seen that, in the log phase, the organisms are reproducing at their maximum rate. There is nothing slowing down their rate of reproduction other than their own capacity to reproduce. But eventually, some environmental factor comes into play which slows down the population growth rate. This is a limiting factor, the factor that limits the rate of population growth even if everything else would allow it to increase. In the case of the yeast in Figure 18.18, the limiting factor may be food supply, or it could be the buildup of toxins such as ethanol. The limiting factor for the greenfly in Figure 18.17 could be predation by ladybirds. The growth of other populations may be limited by disease or the number of nest sites, for example. It is usually very difficult to find out which environmental factors are controlling the size of a population. Almost always, many different factors will interact. A population of rabbits, for example, might be affected by the number of foxes and other predators, the amount of food available, the amount of space for burrows, and the amount of infection by a virus which causes a fatal disease such as myxomatosis. Predator-prey relationships. Figure 18.19 shows an example of how the size of the population of a predator may be affected by its prey. This information comes from the number of skins which were sold by fur traders in northern Canada to the Hudson Bay Company between 1845 and 1925. Snowshoe hares and northern lynxes were both trapped for their fur, and the numbers caught probably give a very good idea of their population sizes. Figure 18.19, changes in the population sizes of snowshoe hares and lynx in northern Canada. Snowshoe hare populations tend to vary from year to year. No one is quite sure why this happens, but it may be related to their food supply. Whenever the snowshoe hare population rises, the lynx population also rises shortly afterwards, as the lynxes now have more food. A drop in the snowshoe hare population is rapidly followed by a drop in the lynx population. The numbers tend to go up and down, or oscillate, but the average population sizes stay roughly the same over many years. Age pyramids. When scientists begin to study a population, they want to know whether the population is growing or shrinking. This can be done by counting the population over many years, or by measuring its birth rate and death rate. But often it is much easier just to count the numbers of individuals in various age groups at one point in time and to draw an age pyramid. Figure 18.20 shows two examples of age pyramids. The area of each box represents the numbers of individuals in that age group. Figure 18.20, age pyramids for two populations. Figure 18.20 is a bottom-heavy pyramid. There are far more young individuals than old ones. This indicates that birth rate is greater than death rate, so this population is increasing. Figure 18.20b shows a much more even spread of ages. Birth rate and death rate are probably about the same. This population will remain about the same size. If an age pyramid is drawn for the human population on Earth, it is bottom-heavy, like Figure 18. 28 age pyramids for many of the world's developing countries are also this shape, showing that their populations are increasing. But an age pyramid for a European country such as France looks more like Figure 18.20b. The human population in France is staying about the same. The human population. Figure 18.21 shows how the human population of the world has changed since about 4000 BC. For most of that time, human populations have been kept in check by a combination of disease, famine and war. Nevertheless, there has still been a steady increase. Figure 18.21 changes in the human population in the last 6,000 years. Twice there have been definite spurts in this growth. The first was around 8000 BC, not shown on the graph, when people in the Middle East began to farm instead of just hunting and finding food. The second began around 300 years ago and is still happening now. In 2020, the world's population reached 7.9 billion. There are two main reasons for this recent growth spurt. The main one is the reduction of disease. Improvements in water supply, sewage treatment, hygienic food handling and general standards of cleanliness have almost wiped out many diseases such as typhoid and dysentery in countries such as the USA and most European countries. Immunization against diseases such as polio has made these very rare indeed. Smallpox has been totally eradicated. And the discovery of antibiotics has now made it possible to treat most diseases caused by bacteria. Secondly, there has been an increase in food supply. More and more land has been brought under cultivation. Moreover, agriculture has become more efficient, so that in many parts of the world each hectare of land is now producing more food than ever before. Questions. 13. Explain the difference between a population and a community. 14. List 3 environmental factors that affect the rate of growth of a population of organisms. 15. Look at the two y-axis scales in Figure 18.19. Describe the difference between them and explain why the numbers of lynx and snowshoe hares are so different from one another. Summary. Biological systems depend on energy that originates from the sun. A food chain shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another. A food web shows many interconnected food chains. Energy flows through living organisms and is eventually lost to the environment. Energy is lost at each step in a food chain. Producers make their own organic nutrients from inorganic ones by photosynthesis using energy from sunlight. Consumers get their energy by eating organic nutrients from other organisms. Consumers are classified as primary, secondary, tertiary or quaternary consumers, depending on their position in a food chain. Herbivores are consumers that get their energy by eating plants, while carnivores get their energy by eating animals. Decomposers are consumers that get their energy by feeding on dead organisms or their organic wastes. A pyramid of numbers is a diagram that shows the relative numbers of organisms at each step in a food chain or web. A pyramid of biomass is similar, but shows the relative quantity of biomass rather than numbers. Each step in the pyramid is a trophic level. A pyramid of energy shows the relative quantities of energy at each trophic level. Energy is normally measured in kJ per unit area per year. Pyramids of biomass are more informative than pyramids of number because they give a better picture of the quantity of energy that is present at each trophic level. As energy passes along a food chain, some is lost within each organism and at each transfer between organisms. The main reasons for loss are respiration and some of the organisms at one level not being eaten or absorbed by the next level. Energy losses mean that there is rarely sufficient energy to support more than 5 links in a food chain. It is more energy efficient for humans to eat crop plants than to eat livestock that have been fed on crop plants. The carbon cycle summarizes how carbon atoms move between organisms and their environment. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the air. Respiration and combustion return carbon dioxide to the air. Fossil fuels contain carbon atoms that were part of organisms that lived a very long time ago. The nitrogen cycle summarizes how nitrogen atoms move between organisms and their environment. Nitrogen gas, N2, is very unreactive and must be converted to nitrate or ammonia before most living organisms are able to use it. This conversion is called nitrogen fixation and is done by lightning and nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrification converts ammonium ions to nitrate ions. Plants take up ammonium or nitrate ions and use them to make amino acids and then proteins. Animals obtain their nitrogen by eating proteins from plants or other animals. Denitrification returns nitrogen gas to the air by converting nitrates back to nitrogen. The rate of growth of a population can be affected by food supply, predation, and disease. A population growth curve is often an S-shape and is described as a sigmoid curve. It is made up of a lag phase, an exponential or log phase, a stationary phase, and a death phase. The environmental factor that limits the rate of growth of a population is called a limiting factor. An age pyramid is a way of showing the age structure of a population at a point in time and can be used to predict how the population size will change in future. Project. Using software to illustrate a food web. You are going to use a computer or tablet to show a food web. You will then share what you have done with the rest of the class. This project is best done with a partner. First, decide on your food web. You could research one in your own area, or you could find information about an interesting food web in a different part of the world. Next, decide what you will do. This will at least partly depend on what software you have available and your expertise in using it. Here are some ideas. Simply draw a diagram of a food web, including pictures of the organisms in it. You could label each organism to show which trophic level it is at and whether it is a producer or a primary, secondary, or tertiary consumer. Add animations to your food web diagram. For example, you could animate the arrows to show energy flowing through the web. You could make your labels interactive so that they only pop up when the user does something. You could produce a series of slides to gradually build up the food web. You could animate some of the slides or the transitions between them. You could add an audio commentary explaining what the screen is showing. You may have other ideas of your own. The aim is not to make things as complicated as possible, but to use what is available to you to produce an attractive and informative representation of a food web and the ways that energy flows through it. Figure 18.22, an illustrated food web. Exam-style questions. 1. What is a community? A group of organisms of the same species, living in the same area at the same time. All the populations of different species living in the same area at the same time. C. A unit containing organisms and their environment, interacting with one another. D. The place where a group of organisms is adapted to live. 2. An organism obtains its energy by killing and eating animals that eat grass. Which terms describe this organism? A carnivore, primary consumer. B. Carnivore, secondary consumer. Herbivore, primary consumer. Herbivore, secondary consumer. 3. How is carbon returned to the air? A. Combustion and photosynthesis. Photosynthesis and feeding and respiration. Respiration and combustion. 4. Organisms that feed at the 5th trophic level are rarer than those that feed at the 4th trophic level. What explains this? A. Energy is lost to the environment each time it is transferred from one trophic level to the next. B. The biomass of predators is generally larger than their prey. C. There is not usually enough space for large carnivores to survive. D. The populations of large predators are more likely to be limited by disease. 6. The diagram shows a food web. A. Explain what the arrows represent. B. Name one producer in this food web. C. Draw a food chain containing 4 organisms that is part of the food web shown above. Use the food web to predict and explain 2 different ways in which a decrease in the population of short-tailed field voles could affect the population of rabbits. 7. A. Choose words or phrases from the list to complete the sentences about the carbon cycle. 0.04% 0.4% decomposes glycogen. Herbivores photosynthesis respiration root hair starch stomata. Approximately of the air is carbon dioxide. This gas diffuses into plants through there and is used to make glucose in the process of. Animals eat plants and some of the carbon atoms in the glucose become part of molecules such as in their bodies. When the animals die, their bodies are broken down by. 5. Which term is used to describe the reactions that change ammonium ions to nitrate ions? A deamination, B. Denitrification, nitrification. Nitrogen fixation. Plants, animals and decomposers return carbon dioxide to the air through. B. Describe how fossil fuels are formed and how the carbon in them is returned to the air. 8. The table shows the numbers of 8 different types of organism in a specified area of a marine ecosystem. Type of organism. Method of feeding. Number of individuals. Phytoplankton. Producer. 10,000. Algae on the seabed. Producer. 700 seaweed. Producer. 500 sea fans. Herbivore. 7,000 parrotfish. Herbivore. 5 surgeon fish. Herbivore. 4 grouper. Carnivore. 3 barracuda. Carnivore. 1. A. Use the data in the table to sketch a pyramid of numbers. Label the trophic levels in your pyramid and indicate the number of organisms represented by each bar in the pyramid. B. Evaluate the extent to which this pyramid of numbers provides a true representation of the quantity of energy at each trophic level in this ecosystem. C. Explain why the numbers of carnivores are smaller than the numbers of herbivores. B. Describe how a nitrogen atom in the air can become part of a protein molecule in a human body. C. Seeds of a plant were carried by wind into a habitat where that species had not grown before. Over the next few years, the plants increased in number. The population then stabilized as the plants had used up most of the nitrate ions in the soil. I sketch a curve to show the changes in this plant population. Label the axes and include the names of the different stages shown by your curve. To use this example to explain the term limiting factor with respect to population growth. 9. A. Proteins contain nitrogen atoms. List the 3 other elements found in all proteins. Self-evaluation checklist. After studying this chapter, think about how confident you are with the different topics. This will help you to see any gaps in your knowledge and help you to learn more effectively. I can see topic. Needs more work. Almost there. Confident to move on. Explain the meanings of the terms habitat, population, community and ecosystem. 18.1. Construct and interpret food chains and food webs using arrows to show how energy is transferred through them. 18.1. Describe the meanings of the terms producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, decomposer and trophic level. 18.1. Identify producers and consumers in food chains and webs and classify consumers as primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary. 18.1. Draw, describe and interpret pyramids of number and pyramids of biomass. 18.1. Describe the carbon cycle, including photosynthesis, respiration, feeding, decomposition, formation of fossil fuels and combustion. 18.2. Draw, describe and interpret pyramids of energy. 18.1. Discuss the advantages of using pyramids of energy rather than pyramids of number or biomass. 18.1. Explain why transfer of energy between trophic levels is inefficient, and use this to explain why food chains rarely have more than 5 trophic levels and why it is more energy efficient for humans to eat plants rather than animals. 18.1. State that food supply, predation, and disease can affect the rate of population growth. 18.3. Identify the lag phase, log or exponential phase, stationary phase and death phase on a sigmoid curve showing population growth. 18.3. Interpret other types of diagrams showing population growth, e.g. age pyramids. 18.3. Describe the nitrogen cycle, including decomposition and the conversion of protein to ammonium ions, nitrification, nitrogen fixation by lightning and bacteria, use of nitrate ions by plants to produce amino acids and proteins, feeding and digestion, deamination, denitrification. 18.2. State the roles of microorganisms in decomposition, nitrification, nitrogen fixation, and denitrification. 18.2. Explain the factors determining each phase in the sigmoid growth curve, including reference to limiting factors. 18.3. Chapter 19. Human influences on ecosystems. In this chapter you will consider how humans have increased food production and how this can affect the environment. Think about why habitats have been destroyed, including deforestation. Learn about some examples of pollution and their effects, including climate change. Discuss reasons for conservation and some of the things that we can do to conserve species, habitats, and ecosystems. Getting started. With a partner, discuss how using the land in the way shown in Figure 19.1 could affect the organisms that might otherwise live there. Make a list of your ideas and then share them with the rest of the class. Figure 19.1, this field is being used to grow lettuce plants. Saving a species on the brink. Black-footed ferrets used to be common on the prairies of North America. But, as humans took over more and more land to graze cattle and grow crops, their habitat and food supply dwindled. Black-footed ferrets are predators that feed almost entirely on burrowing rodents called prairie dogs, and farmers killed large numbers of prairie dogs because they thought the rodents competed with cattle for grass. In 1974, the black-footed ferret was declared extinct in the wild. But in 1981, in Wyoming, a dog brought a dead black-footed ferret to his owners. They notified wildlife officials, who leapt into action. Searchers for the ferrets eventually discovered a small population of them living nearby. Figure 19.2, 2 black-footed ferrets. The wild ferrets were given protection. But, as their numbers remained low, it was eventually decided that they needed more help. Some of the ferrets were taken to zoos, where they were given the right conditions to help them to breed. Many of the offspring were reintroduced into suitable habitats in several states, where their populations are gradually growing. Today, the black-footed ferret is out of danger. Just in time, we managed to reverse a population decline that would have resulted in extinction. Discussion questions. 1. Do you think it is important for humans to try to prevent species from becoming extinct? What are your reasons for your point of view? 2. Is it possible for us to grow enough food to support the growing human population and also look after the natural environment? 19.1 Human pressures on ecosystems. As the human population continues to increase, we are using more and more land for making places to live and for producing food. Our activities are having negative effects on ecosystems all over the world. In this topic, we will look at some of these effects. The last topic in this chapter considers how we can conserve species, habitats, and ecosystems, and why we should try to do this. Food production. Most of the world's supply of food is produced by growing crops or by keeping animals, although we do still harvest fish from the wild in large quantities. During the last few hundred years, the quantity of food produced globally has greatly increased. Figure 19.3 shows the increase in one type of crop, cereal grains, such as wheat and rice, between 1950 and 2012. Figure 19.3 increases in grain production since 1950. It is important that we increase the quantity of food that we produce because the world's increasing population needs to be fed. There are several ways in which this has been achieved. Agricultural machinery. Machinery such as tractors and combine harvesters have made a very big difference. A farmer can now cultivate a much greater area of land in a much shorter time than using manual labor and animals to pull machinery. Figure 19.4, plowing with oxen and a simple wooden plow is very slow, and the plow cannot go very deep into the soil. Figure 19.5, a tractor allows a farmer to plow much more land and to plow more deeply than without machinery. Agricultural chemicals. Farmers are also using agricultural chemicals to help to improve the growth of their crops so that they can get more yield from the same area of ground. Chemical fertilizers add more mineral ions, such as nitrate ions, to soils that do not contain enough of them. Insecticides are sprayed onto crops to kill insect pests that might reduce yields or make the crop look less appealing to buyers. Herbicides are sprayed to kill weeds, which would compete with the crop plants and reduce their growth. Although all of these chemicals are expensive, the cost is outweighed by the increased quantity and quality of the crops when they are harvested. Figure 19.6, the men are spraying insecticides onto a rice crop to kill insects and reduce the losses from insects such as leafhoppers. Figure 19.7, removing weeds from a crop reduces competition with the crop plants for water, mineral ions and light. However, weeding by hand is very labor-intensive. Figure 19.8, spraying with selective herbicides, which kill weeds but not the crop plants, can cover a lot more ground much more quickly. Here the soya beans are unharmed, but the grass growing between the rows is dying. Selective breeding. Careful selection of plants and animals to produce new varieties has played an important part in increasing world food production. We have seen how breeders can choose parents, generation after generation, to produce new and improved varieties of animals and plants. For example, modern wheat varieties produce far more grain per plant than older ones did. Selective breeding has also produced crop plants that can grow in poor soils or that are resistant to diseases. Cattle now produce much more meat or milk than they did in the past, and hens lay more eggs, all as a result of selective breeding. The way that selective breeding is done, and some examples, are described in Chapter 17, Topic 17.2. Monocultures. Crop plants are usually grown as large areas of a single variety. This is called a monoculture. Figure 19.9, this photograph shows ripe wheat that has been grown as a monoculture, a large area in which only wheat plants grow. All the wheat plants are the same variety, so they all tend to grow to the same height and ripen at the same time, making them easy to harvest. Monocultures make sowing, tending, harvesting and selling a crop more efficient for the farmer. This is because using machinery to cultivate a large, uninterrupted area of land can be done more quickly and efficiently than tending several small, separate fields. A uniform crop is likely to grow to the same height and ripen at the same time, so it can all be harvested at once using specialized machinery. A large area of the same crop can all be treated with the same herbicides or pesticides in the same way at the same time, increasing efficiency. A monoculture will probably produce large quantities of seeds, fruit, or other harvestable parts that are all uniform in size and quality, making it easier for the farmer to market and more profitable to sell. Monocultures do, however, also have some disadvantages. Reduction in biodiversity. Monocultures are very different from natural ecosystems. In a natural ecosystem, there are usually many different species of plants growing, which in turn support many different species of animals. We say that there is a high biodiversity. In a monoculture, biodiversity is low. Only a few species can live where the crop is growing. Figure 19.10, the natural ecosystem in much of Indonesia is rainforest. It contains an enormous number of different species of plants and animals. Figure 19.11, over huge areas of Indonesia, the rainforest has been cut down and replaced with oil palms. The biodiversity here is very low in comparison with the natural forest. Increase in pests. Another problem with monocultures is that they can lead to an increase in the populations of organisms that are pests of the crop. For example, leafhoppers feed on the sap of rice plants and can greatly reduce yields. They also transfer plant viruses to the rice, which cause serious diseases in the plants. If a large area of land is covered with only rice plants, then leafhoppers have so much food available to them that their population can become enormous. Farmers can try to reduce the quantities of these pests by spraying insecticides onto the crop. However, this also kills other harmless insects, including predatory insects and spiders that would help to reduce the leafhopper population. It is also very expensive. And, in many places, leafhoppers have become resistant to the insecticides and are no longer killed by them. Many farmers try to use other methods of controlling insect pests. One approach is to use mixed cropping, where only fairly small areas of ground are covered with the same crop at the same time of year. This makes it more difficult for insect pests to spread from one rice field to another. Reduction in soil fertility. Farmers sometimes grow the same crop on the same land for several years in succession. The crop plants all need the same mineral ions, so over time the minerals that they need are removed from the soil. The farmer has to keep adding fertilizers to replace these minerals, or the yield from the crop will steadily reduce year by year. Growing a mixture of different crops and changing the crop that is grown on a particular piece of ground from one year to the next helps to maintain a better balance of minerals in the soil. Intensive livestock production. In many parts of the world, cattle and other livestock are kept outside. They graze on grass or are fed by people bringing freshly cut vegetation for them to eat. This is called extensive livestock production. The livestock do not take too much from their environment and do not do much damage to it. Figure 19.12 Extensive production of cattle in Africa. These Ankole-Watusi cattle have a large area in which they can feed. In developed countries, livestock are often farmed intensively. This means that large numbers of livestock are kept in an area that would not normally be able to support more than a very small number of animals. The farmer uses high inputs to increase the production of milk, meat, or wool from his animals. This means, for example, using high-energy foods to feed the animals. Regular medication may be given to stop the development of disease. The animals may be kept in temperature-controlled buildings to maximize their growth rates. Figure 19.13 These cattle are being kept to produce milk. They are farmed intensively and are given supplementary feed when they come into the barn each day to be milked. Intensive farming does have some advantages. It can help to provide more food for people and can sometimes provide it more cheaply than extensive systems. This could mean that fewer people go hungry. Another possible advantage is that it takes up less land than extensive farming, which means that more land could perhaps be left in its natural state, providing habitats for other species. However, intensive farming has some big disadvantages. There can be welfare issues for the livestock, which may suffer in the crowded conditions in which they are kept. Disease can spread easily among them. In some countries, this is dealt with by giving the animals regular doses of antibiotics, which, as we saw in Chapter 17, increases the risk that bacteria will develop resistance to the antibiotics. The waste from the intensive farming unit can pollute land and waterways nearby. Food for the animals is often produced from food that we could eat ourselves, such as soya beans. As we saw in Chapter 18, this is wasteful because we would get more energy from the beans themselves, rather than feeding them to cattle or other livestock. Energy is used to transport feed to the livestock, often over very long distances. If the animals are kept inside buildings, energy may also be used to maintain the temperature of the buildings in which they are kept, either by heating it or using air conditioning to keep it cool. Large quantities of water may need to be provided if large numbers of animals are kept in one place. Sometimes, this takes badly needed water from the surrounding environment so that other animals and plants cannot live there. Figure 19.14 This satellite image shows the delta of the Great Colorado River in the southwest of the USA. So much water is taken from the river upstream for intensive livestock production and growing crops that only a trickle of water actually reaches the sea. Activity 19.1 Local farming practices. Work in a group of 3 or 4 to find out about some local farming practices. You could look at crops that are grown or animals that are kept. If possible, different groups in your class could find out about different types of farming. Write a short, illustrated report on your findings. Try not to use more than 250 words in your report. Here are some issues you could think about. You do not need to report on all of them. Is the farming practice you are reporting on intensive or extensive? Does it involve the use of agricultural machinery, fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides? What are the advantages of this type of farming practice? How does the farming practice affect the local environment? How does the farming practice affect the quantity and quality of food that is produced? Questions. 1. Choose the correct word or words to complete each sentence. Agricultural machinery, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, selective breeding. Farmers add to crops to provide nutrients so that the plants will grow faster. B. Farmers use to kill weeds, reducing competition and increasing the yield of the crop. C. Farmers use over many generations to improve production by crop plants and livestock. D. Farmers use to enable them to cultivate more land in a shorter period of time. E. Farmers use to kill insect pests that would reduce the yield of their crops. 2a. Outline 2 reasons why growing monocultures helps to produce more food. B. Outline 2 ways in which growing monocultures can harm ecosystems. 3. Figure 19.15 shows chickens being farmed intensively. Outline the disadvantages of this method of farming chickens. Figure 19.15, intensive chicken farming. Habitat destruction. We have seen that each species has adaptations that help it survive in its particular habitat. If humans destroy that habitat, then it is difficult for many species to survive in the new environment that results. Habitats are destroyed when we use land for our own purposes. Here are some examples. We cut down native vegetation to make land available for growing crops, for farming livestock, for building houses and factories, and for building roads. We damage habitats when we mine for natural resources, such as metal ores, building materials such as sand or gravel, or fossil fuels. The mine itself destroys the habitats by removing the soil and vegetation, and toxic runoff can enter rivers or the soil in the surrounding area. We add pollutants to land and water, which can kill the plants that normally live there, and so change the habitat. Figure 19.16, this huge open-pit copper mine is in Chile, in South America. Habitats can also be damaged if we remove key species from them. For example, collecting live corals from coral reefs damages the whole coral reef habitat, endangering the hundreds of species of other animals that depend on corals. Corals contain tiny photosynthetic algae inside their bodies, which are the start of every food chain on the reef. This is an example of how, by damaging the food webs in a habitat, we can affect the habitats of all the plants and animals that live there. Figure 19.17, all the organisms that live on this coral reef, in the Red Sea off the coast of Sudan, depend on the living coral animals to provide their habitat. Deforestation. Humans have always cut down trees. Wood is an excellent fuel and building material. The land on which trees grow can be used for growing crops for food or to sell. 1,000 years ago, most of Europe was covered by forests. Now, most of them have been cut down. The cutting down of large numbers of trees is called deforestation. Deforestation on a huge scale has happened in many countries recently and is still continuing in many places. Figure 19.18, when rainforest is cut down and burnt, as here in Brazil, habitats are destroyed, large amounts of carbon dioxide are released and soil is eroded. Rainforests occur in temperate and tropical regions of the world. Recently, most concern about deforestation has been about the loss of tropical rainforests. In the tropics, the relatively high and constant temperatures and high rainfall provide perfect conditions for the growth of plants. A rainforest is a very special place, full of many different species of plants and animals. More different species live in a small area of rainforest than in an equivalent area of any other habitat in the world. Rainforest has a high biodiversity. Figure 19.19, this rainforest is in the Royal Belem State Park in Malaysia, where it is protected from damage by humans. When an area of rainforest is cut down, the soil under the trees is exposed to the rain. The soil of a rainforest is very thin. It is quickly washed away once it loses its protective cover of plants and the roots that help to bind it together. This soil erosion may make it very difficult for the forest to grow back again, even if the land is left alone. The soil can also be washed into rivers, filling them with soil so that the water overflows and causes flooding. Figure 19.20, the trees that used to cover this hillside were cut down so that people could grow crops. Instead, the rain is washing the unprotected soil down the hillside. Figure 19.21, how human activities can increase soil erosion. The loss of part of a rainforest means a loss of a habitat for many different species of animals. Even if small islands of forest are left as reserves, these may not be large enough to support a breeding population of the animals. Deforestation threatens many species of animals and plants with extinction. Figure 19.22, many animals, such as these macaws, cannot survive if deforestation destroys their habitat. The loss of so many trees can also affect the water cycle and the amount of rain that falls nearby. While trees are present and rain falls, a lot of it is taken up by the trees and transported into their leaves. It then evaporates and goes back into the atmosphere in the process of transpiration. If the trees have gone, then the rain simply runs off the soil and into rivers. Much less goes back into the air as water vapor. The air becomes drier and less rain falls. This can make it much more difficult for people to grow crops and keep livestock. Most tropical rainforests grow in developing countries, and in some countries many of the people are very poor. The people may cut down the forests to clear land on which they can grow food. It is difficult to expect someone who is desperately trying to produce food to keep their family alive not to clear land unless you can offer some alternative. International conservation groups such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature and governments of the richer, developed countries can help. Money provided by these